The film that you are going to see is about a country few people have heard of and even fewer people have visited. The Kingdom of Bhutan, a small independent nation in the eastern Himalayas. My family and I had the privilege and opportunity of visiting Bhutan on 3 separate occasions since 1972, traveling through many different areas, and yet we learned a great deal about the kingdom from this film. I'm sure that you will find Bhutan as unique a place and worthy of your interest as my family and I did. At the end, I will have a few more remarks to make about several important developments in Bhutan which have happened since this program was completed. But now, let's watch the film.
Think of a country with no railway, no airline, no television station, no daily newspaper, where a young king rules over an independent people. A country with rich classical traditions and a vigorous popular culture, where yaks graze in high Himalayan pastures, where archery is the national sport and Buddhism the national religion. Long ago, the Western imagination created the image of an isolated country, a guardian of ancient knowledge, wiser and more peaceful than our own troubled nations. Looking down today on Thimphu, capital of Bhutan, one could believe that this is such a place. In this film, we explore the myth and reality of life in this little-known kingdom of the Eastern Himalayas. Before roads came to Bhutan in the 1960s, the country had little contact with the outside world. To the south are the dense subtropical forests of the foothills leading to the plains of India. To the north, the massive peaks of the high Himalayas, straddling the frontier with Tibet. So the survival of Bhutan as an independent state, a country little bigger than Switzerland or Denmark, can partly be explained by its remoteness. Thimphu, the capital, has 20,000 of the country's 1 million people. Ethnically, they are extraordinarily diverse, some speaking languages as different from each other as any of those in Europe. As in Europe too, people from the countryside flock to the capital. The population is further swollen by migrant workers from India and Nepal. The architecture of Thimphu aims to introduce modern development in harmony with its traditional styles, to keep the best of the old and use only what is needed from the outside. Despite the atmosphere of a minor boom town, there is just one traffic policeman on duty, one of the few in the whole country. Bhutan's contact with the outside world is through India. The frontier lies where the foothills begin and the rivers from the north end their long descent. This is a region of lush vegetation and subtropical forests, in contrast to the high alpine valleys of the north. It's through the new and busy border town of Pinseling that most foreign trade now enters the country. The roads which link India with the central Bhutanese valleys were built mainly for strategic purposes by the Indian Army. Later they were extended for economic development. And now they are the main arteries of change, winding and twisting along the valleys and up into the central heartland. On the foothills above the plains, the monsoon rains fall heavily, 300 inches a year. The few villages which lie within reach of the road retain much of their traditional way of life. Bhutan is the only country in South Asia which is not overpopulated. Despite large numbers of immigrants from Nepal, who have settled in the south, some Tibetan refugees, and the migrant workers from India. The government allows these people so far into the country, but no further. But these new roads make the Bhutanese increasingly mobile. One of the greatest natural resources of Bhutan is water, and with it, water power. Several hydroelectric plants have been completed, and apart from its own needs, Bhutan will provide electric power for India and Bangladesh. In a country that is crisscrossed by rivers and river valleys, bridges have been in use for centuries. The descendants of a famous bridge builder, a Buddhist saint born in 1385, made this temple as their residence, near one of his many iron-chain suspension bridges. His descendants still occupy the temple today. The valley of Paru in the west of Bhutan, 7,500 feet high, has always been an important agricultural and religious center. The valley floor is covered with paddy fields and the hills above dotted with monasteries and hermitages. It is in valleys like these, irrigated by rivers which flow down from the Tibetan border, that most Bhutanese have their homes. For centuries, this market in Paru was one of the few places in the country where luxuries from India and Tibet, such as silk and spices, could be bought. Most transactions were done by barter. Today, like everywhere else, they're done with money. But in the life of the Bhutanese peasant, higher spiritual things are as important as temporal ones. The hermitage of Taksang, the lair of the tigress, hangs perilously on a cliff in the north of Paru. The long climb to this sacred sanctuary is made by pilgrims from all over the country. The teachings of the Buddha explain how all suffering is conditioned by desire. To remove desire and so defeat suffering, it is necessary to control the mind. This, it is said, is achieved by meditation. And the natural place for that is in high places, far removed from the turmoils of the world. Taksang is linked to the mythical origins of Bhutan in the 8th century, when Padmasambhava, a saint and wizard born in what is now Pakistan, transformed himself into a menacing figure riding a pregnant tigress. This was to subdue the demons of the south who were hindering his work of converting Tibet to Buddhism. Prayer flags appease the local spirits with the magical spells that are printed on them. In the temples of Bhutan, Buddhist arts still flourish. The clay sculptures in particular are unrivaled in the Buddhist world today. With the Buddhist religion that came from Tibet came also many invading armies. The ruins of this fort lie at the top of the Paru Valley. Its name, Drugi Dzong, means Fort of the Bhutanese Victory and commemorates the repulse of a Tibetan invasion. Until the 1950s, when it was destroyed by fire, the fort, stocked with ancient armor and muzzle loaders, stood as it always had done. Many people today remember it as it used to be. The main Himalayan range on Bhutan's northern border has provided an even better defense than its forts. The passes could be easily defended, but they did permit cultural and commercial contacts. After the occupation of Tibet by China in the 1950s, however, the border was sealed. It's been said that Bhutan now survives as the one resolute and self-contained representative of a fast disappearing civilization. There are not many Western experts on Bhutan. One of them, Dr. Michael Aris of Oxford University, spent many years there and is an authority on its history and traditions.
It's a world where you find a highly developed culture, the preserve of a monastic elite, and below that you find a vigorous popular culture in the villages. At the same time, it's a world of intense personal devotion to a chosen leader. In the early years of the 17th century, there arrived in Bhutan a very strange and remarkable character who is known to all Bhutanese, even today, as the Shabdrung. He arrived in Bhutan as a political refugee. He was fleeing from the opposition of the Tibetan ruler of his day, and he was the hereditary prince abbot of a Buddhist sect known as the Drukpa. Now, this sect already had great control over large parts of western Bhutan, and the Shabdrung was able to use the existing estates of the Drukpa as a power base from which to extend his control over the whole of the country. He is remembered today as a great statesman, as a general, as a scholar and mystic, and as the practitioner of magic. During his lifetime, he built a chain of forts right across Bhutan, in all the major valleys of the west. These fortresses are also, of course, monasteries. Now, while he was doing this, Tibet invaded Bhutan no less than 6 times. That's roughly between 1620 and 1651. When the Shabdrung died in 1651, his court was left in a tremendous quandary as to how to find a successor. For half a century, it was pretended that the Shabdrung was in a retreat. He was meditating and not to be disturbed. In fact, of course, he was dead. While the secret was being maintained, the corpse of the Shabdrung was kept in the central tower of the Dzong of Punakha, until it got to the point where the fiction could no longer be maintained. And it was decided to adopt the same solution which Tibet had meanwhile found, that's to say, the recognized reincarnation of the Shabdrung was discovered and installed as the official successor. After repulsing so many Tibetan invasions from the north, Bhutanese attentions gradually focused on India to the south. And it was this growing interest in Indian trade and profit which embroiled the Bhutanese for the first time in a border war with the British in the 1770s. For the first 2 centuries or so after the unification of Bhutan, the government of the country lay almost exclusively in the hands of Buddhist monks, all of them very fine scholars, but constitutionally unsuited to deal with civil matters. Gradually, more and more lay people came to displace the monks in government, and the lay element was particularly represented by the very powerful local barons known as Pönlops and Dzongpens. I think the reason why Bhutan survives today, one of the reasons at least, is because gradually a lay element came to dominate the structure of government. I think if monks had continued to rule Bhutan this century, Bhutan would have disappeared in the same way that Tibet has so recently disappeared.
The strength of the provincial governors was based on their right to conscript a feudal militia, seen here in this unique 1931 film recently discovered in a house in London. Besides fighting, the militia had to act as ceremonial escort for the governors and their guests. The music and dancing on these occasions is intended to emulate the performance of divine attendants who welcome honored beings to the heavenly palace of Padma Sambhava. At the beginning of this century, monarchy came to Bhutan, and as with other monarchies, the king appointed relations and favorites to key positions. But although this aimed for unity, it was fraught with problems. Paru, for instance, was governed by a close relation of the first king. Yet even so, he would occasionally place on his own head the raven crown which belonged to the king alone. The Dzong of Paru, known locally as the Heap of Jewels, still fulfills the same function as when it was built in 1645, though its defensive role has now lapsed. It's the administrative center for all the Paru region of some 63,000 people. Local education, justice, and taxation are all dealt with here. Recently, all the Dzongs have been given greater responsibility for development in each region. Regional autonomy is coming back. At present, Bhutan is trying to harmonize modern developments with its ancient traditions. The dzong, after all, is basically a religious structure dedicated to revering all forms of life. These include the bees, which make their hives beneath the temple eaves. The monks of the Paro dzong, under their own abbot, are enrolled at an early age. It's a matter of great prestige for a family to have a son accepted by this community, with its traditions of study and ritual going back to the 17th century. The monks are the most conservative group in the whole community. They are trained to memorize long texts whose inner meaning they may never fully grasp. Theirs is less of a vocation than a profession dedicated to the performance of ceremonies which enhance the spiritual ideology of the state. Many in Bhutan would say that the spiritual core of the country lies less in the dzongs, where traditions have tended to stagnate, and more in the remote mountain hermitages. The capital dzong in Thimphu, known to the Bhutanese as Tashish dzong, the fort of auspicious religion, has provided the model for all the provincial dzongs. Built in 1641, this fortress was destroyed by fire in 1772 and then rebuilt. In the late 1960s, it was again rebuilt to house the permanent secretariat of the central government. Two of the original buildings were kept, both a complex of Buddhist temples. In the old days, practically the whole revenue of the country went towards maintaining these dzongs, all of them dedicated to the Buddhist faith and to the Drukpa school in particular. About 400 monks, supported by the state, spend the summer months in Tashish dzong. The government officers have to leave each day by dusk, and it's forbidden for any woman to spend the night there. The community is ruled by the head abbot of Bhutan. Beneath the abbot are 4 senior teachers, responsible for tantric ritual, philosophical logic, grammar, and monastic chant. Discipline is in the hands of middle-aged monks called proctors. They sometimes use their whips on the younger monks, but can only scold the older ones. The monks used to be a law to themselves, but now are subject to the monarchy. Their voice, though, is heard and respected. And the strength of their influence is reflected in their sonorous and hallowed music. Buddhist literature is written in classical Tibetan, a language which has scarcely changed since the 8th century, similar to the position of Latin in medieval Europe. Recently, the government committed the vernacular language of Dzongkha to a written form. It is now taught in all schools as the national language, which it is hoped will further unify the country. But the old classical texts are lovingly preserved in the archives of the various dzongs. Every summer, the Dzong of Thimphu is the scene of a grand week-long festival of sacred dance. The costumes of the dancers represent a multitude of deities which have been revered for generations. The seat of the old governor of Paru is today one of the official residences of the Queen Mother of Bhutan. Its sacred architecture reinforces the continuing interdependence of the secular and the religious. The present king, Jigme Singye Wangchuk, spent much of his youth here. Today he lives next to the Tashisha Dzong in the Thimphu Valley. His cottage, by contrast, is a modest building which he inherited from his father. Amid scenes of medieval pomp, the present king celebrated his official coronation in 1974. At the age of 19, he was the world's youngest monarch. He had been well schooled in his duties by his father, so did not ascend his throne unprepared. Just before his coronation, it was said, a plot to oust him and his family had been discovered, and the plotters were all imprisoned or forced to flee. The king, in the presence of foreign guests and his officers of state, was enthroned in his capital in a lavish ceremony presided over by the head abbot, and witnessed with great pride by his mother. Today, the monarchy is just 4 generations old. The present king's great-grandfather, Ugyen Wangchuk, was the governor of Tongsa, the largest and most important of all the dzongs of eastern Bhutan. He inherited this from his father, chief enemy of the British in the Anglo-Bhutan War of 1865, which resulted in the annexation of Bhutan's territory in the Indian plains. At a time of chronic feuding, Ugyen Wangchuck emerged as the most powerful and respected of the Bhutanese leaders. And his prestige was further enhanced by virtue of his descent from the famous 15th century Buddhist saint, Pema Lingpa. The British were grateful to Ugyen Wangchuck for mediating between them and the Tibetans during the Young Husband Expeditionary Force to Tibet in 1904. In 1907, Ugyen Wangchuck was installed as first king in the old winter capital at Punakha. He replaced the last of the regents, the Deb Rajas, also the Dharma Raja, then acting as overall head of state. With the swearing of allegiance to Ugyen Wangchuck and his heirs in this document of 1907, all political power in Bhutan has since lain with the monarchy. The second king ruled from 1926 to 1952. Like his father, he enjoyed good relations with the British, but the continuing isolation of Bhutan meant that the British political officer for the area resided in Sikkim. The political officer in 1931, Colonel Weir, crossed from Sikkim through Tibet to Bhutan to present the king with the insignia of the Knight Commander of the Indian Empire. Colonel Weir and his family were entertained with ceremonies and sacred dances composed by Saint Pema Lingpa. Jigme Dorje Wangchuck, the third king, seen here with the head abbot, identified very closely with his people. Joining in the threshing of wheat with villagers, taking part in archery contests. His reign from 1952 to 1972 bridged the world of past and present, and prepared the way for his little son eventually to bring the country into the 20th century. Jigme Dorje Wangchuck died early, but he remains a popular and revered figure in Bhutan today. More than 70 years after the monarchy's foundation, the enthronement of the first king is celebrated as Bhutan's national day. Every year, the king travels to a different part of the country to visit and celebrate with his people. In his 10-year reign, the young king has gained greatly in confidence and self-expression. He likes personally to explain the policies of his government. He also keeps in close touch with the aspirations of his people, as in this local equivalent of the English Royal Walkabout. Here, he and his officials serve tea and a meal to this gathering of his subjects. More important, he's also involved in detailed talks on local economic development, in this case in eastern Bhutan. The main forum for consultation is the National Assembly. It meets twice a year in this building inside the Dzong at Thimphu. It's a conservative body and has resisted the monarchy's attempts to introduce Western democracy. The Assembly is also the chief legislative body and is composed of representatives of the government, the monks, and the public. Members are guaranteed freedom of speech and can pass resolutions on any subject by a two-thirds majority. But the really important decisions are still taken in the palace. The lives of most Bhutanese are far removed from government, monastery, and monarchy. It's here in the fertile fields that they work and live, raising crops and tending animals that make them self-sufficient. But ancient methods still prevail. A traditional family house is made mostly of wood and pounded earth. It has 3 layers. The top for the storage of hay, which gives insulation during the winter. The middle section, which provides the family living area, and the ground floor for the animals. Bhutan has its fair share of blacksmiths. And they're particularly skilled as silversmiths. Perhaps they're best known, though, for their beautiful hand-woven fabrics used in the traditional dress of all Bhutanese. Centuries of internal warfare made the Bhutanese highly skilled archers. Today, archery has become the national sport. The archers compete in local and national contests. 2 teams take turns shooting at opposite targets almost 200 yards away. Young and old alike turn out to support their team. With contestants standing so near the target to distract the opposing team, it's amazing the competitors ever hit the target and also manage to miss each other. But away from the valleys, up in the high country to the north, with its streams and glacial lakes, yak herders and their families lead lonely and isolated lives. Yaks are one of the few domestic animals capable of thriving at altitudes above 12,000 feet. They are the descendants of wild herds that still roam the remote parts of the Himalayas. They are highly valued as beasts of burden for their hair and hides, which are used to make tents, ropes, rugs and clothing, and for their milk, which is a staple in the yak herder's diet. These nomadic people spend the summer with their animals in these high pastures. The milk is also used for making butter and cheese, which in turn are used for barter. One simple tent of woven yak hair serves as shelter for the whole family. Far from these lonely reaches, halfway across the world in New York City, lives the Bhutanese ambassador to the United Nations, Om Pradhan. What does he have to say about his country's economic policies?
His Majesty has decreed that socio-economic development in Bhutan should take place to the extent possible, utilizing our own resources and our own people, and that this development should start at the grassroots level, or rather the bottom layer of our society, instead of hoping that prosperity will trickle down to these layers from the top. When we started the process of socio-economic development in Bhutan in 1961, the royal government of Bhutan firstly had no option but to import a foreign workforce from our neighboring countries in order to enable us to undertake some infrastructural projects like road and building constructions, hydroelectric power plants and other projects. And there is a clear understanding within the royal government of Bhutan that once the projects for which this foreign workforce was imported are completed, this foreign workforce would leave the country and go back to their own homes. However, there may be instances when Bhutan would require some foreign workforce to maintain those projects where it may not be possible for us to do it ourselves. Well, in that case, we will have to determine and take some measures which will ensure that it does not affect Bhutan's society as a whole.
So what in fact makes a person Bhutanese?
Well, in the same manner as an American is an American, Bhutanese, irrespective of his ethnic background, is a Bhutanese if he is recognized as such within the legal framework of Bhutan in this respect.
Would you say that there is a class system in Bhutan?
One's status in society could be determined by one's relationship to some prominent historical, religious, or other personalities, or one's own status in the government hierarchy. But I cannot really say that there is a class system in the sense that it prevails in other neighboring countries of Bhutan. I would say that all Bhutanese, if they have the education and the background, could reach to positions of power and privilege. And the attempt of the government of Bhutan is to try and provide basic education to the maximum number of people within the country.
Tourism is an important part of Bhutan's development policy, but remains a sensitive issue.
Bhutan started the process of socio-economic development much later than many of the other countries in our region. This enabled us to observe some of their mistakes, and we observed that a large influx of tourism into a country, particularly a small country, tended to sometimes adversely affect the general way of life of the people. On the other hand, since we in Bhutan lacked any major source of foreign currency earning, we could not do away with tourism entirely. In view of this, the Royal Government of Bhutan has laid down a policy whereby tourists are permitted to enter the country, but only in very small numbers.
Remote districts near the border with Tibet, like this one, Ling Shi, are rarely visited by anyone, let alone tourists. It's administered from this small dzong, which is inhabited only by a lama, a civil administrator, and their families, in sharp contrast to the hundreds of monks and civil servants in the dzongs of Thimphu and Paru. Among these desolate mountains, sandwiched between China and the Indian subcontinent, one considers Bhutan's relations with the outside world, shaped as they are by geography, history, and her status as a non-aligned developing nation. Most important is her relationship with India, established by a treaty signed by these Bhutanese officials in 1949. Article 2 requires that Bhutan follow the direction of India in foreign affairs.
As far as Article 2 of the 1949 treaty is concerned, the interpretation that we have of this particular article within Bhutan is very clear. We have no objections to consult with the government of India on matters of mutual interest. However, we have determined that as far as any decisions in the sector of foreign relations is concerned, that such decisions would solely rest with the Royal Government of Bhutan itself.
But such considerations hardly affect the lives of the great majority of the Bhutanese people. For much of the country is still virtually impenetrable and can only be reached after days on foot or horseback. It is over this whole northern area that the Himalayan range soars spectacularly. Chomalari, the sacred mountain of Bhutan, 24,000 feet, towers over icy rivers and pastures rich with rhododendrons, edelweiss and gentian. Where these pastures meet the rocky crags and cliffs live buru, the blue sheep of the Himalaya. Strange creatures, half sheep and half goat, they forage among the rocks and snows and are prey only to the wolves and snow leopards with whom they share this remote range.
We are trying to play as effective a part as possible in the international community, and we feel that because of Bhutan's non-aligned status, that we would be able to play a more effective role in the international community for the preservation of international peace and security. It seems that every section of Bhutanese society, no matter which part of the country they come from, no matter what their ethnic backgrounds, would like to preserve this traditional and cultural heritage of Bhutan, as this is what really makes us a very distinct society in our part of the world.
Since the film was created, several new and interesting developments have occurred in the Kingdom of Bhutan, and I would like to bring you up to date on them. The Bhutanese proudly announced recently the inauguration of their own airline, Juke Air, which now flies several times a week between Calcutta in India and the beautiful Bhutanese valley of Pero. The opening of this airline has facilitated access to and from Bhutan, access which had hitherto only been possible overland through northern India the way I went, with a Bhutanese visa now the only document required for entry into the country. Furthermore, additional parts of the country are beginning to be opened up to tourists. With this development, the east of Bhutan is open to explorers it never was before. Perhaps the most significant recent development involving all the countries in the South Asian region is the creation of a new regional cooperative movement. This newly formed group, the South Asian Regional Council, called SARC, will undoubtedly have far-reaching ramifications. In August 1983, the member states, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, held their fourth meeting. This organization may well have the same sort of significance as a regional body for problem solving and technical and economic cooperation as ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has had in its region, and may set new grounds for political relations between member states as well. As you have seen, the Kingdom of Bhutan, in addition to being an extremely beautiful and remote part of the world with an unusual and highly developed culture, is an inspiring model of a developing country modernizing very much in harmony with its own culture and traditions. I shall continue to follow the progress of this remarkable country as time goes on, and I trust that after watching this program, you too will have gained new insights and enduring interest in the ability of small, independent nations to guide their own destinies. Thank you.